Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today and for tuning in for this talk with David Barry, our curator of our orchid show. I know many of you know David and have been to his presentations before, so we're really glad to be able to share it with you from our offices into the comfort of your home. So thanks again for joining us. For those of you I don't know, my name is Jeannie Perales. I'm the Vice President for Museum Exhibitions, Learning and Engagement here at Selby Gardens. And this is my co-curator, friend and colleague, Dr. David Barry from the Ringling Museum. David's been working with us since 2014, actually. He's been a consultant and curator at large and our all-around go-to guy for anything museum, garden, and library. So we're really pleased to work with David and to be able to present the Orchid Show every year and offer some great talks by him. So today's presentation is going to be a slideshow presented by David, and we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. And for those of you who may not have used Zoom webinar before, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. So if you want to interact with us, we ask you to use either the Q&A function or the chat feature, which is just one of the features, two of the features in Zoom. So in fact, right now we could get started if you like, and you can tell us where you're from. So I see there's a couple people already using the chat feature here, and you can also, as I said, use the Q&A. So if you're calling in or tuning in from somewhere else, let us know where you're from, because it's always fun for us to see where people are tuning in from. When we do these virtual talks, we can reach some of our friends up north too. Got Erica coming in from Pelican Cove, Wes Higgins, hi Wes, from Cape Coral, and more, I'm sure. So keep them coming. Osprey, wonderful. In the meantime, I'll just kind of introduce and contextualize the program today while we're waiting to see where everyone's coming in from. So each year we do an orchid show, and I know many of you have been to our orchid show before. And for those of you who haven't been, we're going to show you a little video tour to see what it looks like this year. This year we have multiple themes going on. So I want to kind of explain the themes of the show so that it sort of all makes sense and hangs together. I'm getting lots more people here. We've got Lori from Sarasota, Olivia Breda. Hi, Olivia. Her work is featured in the show. A Selby and Ringling member and volunteer and love going to David Barry's talks. Awesome. Roberta from Siesta Key, Sandra Biller, another Roberta in Sarasota. So lots of folks that are local today tuning in, which is wonderful. So this year's show is entitled the 45th Anniversary Orchid Show, Women Breaking the Glass House Ceiling. So first and foremost, our orchid show is always a celebration of our world-class orchid collection. In particular, our living collection, which is in the conservatory, the Tropical Conservatory, which of course is the first thing that people see when they come to the gardens. But in the museum, we do a cross-section of our preserved and bibliographic or library collections. And that's the portion that David and I really work on. Our horticulture team, we work with them, but they do all the designs and the building and everything in the conservatory. They don't let us touch the plants, right, David? Not the living ones anyway. We're allowed to touch the dead plants. So there's a couple other kind of themes going on in this year's show. This happens to be the centennial anniversary of the purchase of Bill and Marie's property. They purchased this property in 1920. And so we thought that was something worth celebrating. And then once we thought about the year 1920 and knowing that this is an election year, and by the way, I think this is a really nice distraction today, so I hope you all enjoy having something else to focus on than the election. We thought this would be a great opportunity for us to celebrate the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which guaranteed women the right to vote. And so what better place to do that than a floral celebration in the conservatory? And then to top it all off, we are celebrating our 45th anniversary of Selby Gardens opening to the public in 1975. So you see there, we've got this big, beautiful floral anniversary celebration. And then the female theme kind of came about because we wanted to celebrate and honor our female founder, Marie Selby. So as we started to do that, David started to really look at our collections, our library collections, and realized we had all these fantastic botanical illustrations from these Victorian era female illustrators who were not very well known or celebrated in their time. So we thought this would be a really nice way to pay respect to them, to the work that they did, the beauty of what they created, and showcase it for you and share it with our garden guests. So that's how we came up with all the various themes for this year's show. So now I just have a couple of quick little video clips. The first one is a promotional video about the orchid show. It's really a walk through the show. It takes 1 minute, and you'll get to see the beauty of this floral celebration. And the next is just another couple minutes, and our president and CEO, Jennifer Romanecki, will welcome you to this year's exhibition and say some acknowledgements of those who helped make it possible. So I'm going to showcase that, and then I'll introduce David. Well, let's see, we've got more people tuning in. Chelsea from Washington, D.C., I think you are the furthest participant today. So thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. Oh, Minneapolis too. Wonderful. We're keeping an eye on Minneapolis. Okay, here we go.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Romanecki, President and CEO of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the 45th Anniversary Orchid Show, Women Breaking the Glass House Ceiling. This year marks the 45th anniversary of the official opening of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens' downtown Sarasota campus. To celebrate, the annual Orchid Show will honor the founder, Marie Selby, and highlight the accomplishments of the many notable women who have built on her legacy and helped to make Selby Gardens home to the best scientifically documented collection of orchids in the world. The Orchid Show will combine a spectacular display of living orchids in the Tropical Conservatory with an impressive exhibition of orchid treasures from Selby Gardens Library and preserved collections in the Museum of Botany and the Arts. To these will be added a stunning display of orchids and roses at the Selby House, marking the 100th anniversary of William and Marie Selby's purchase of the property in Sarasota on which Selby Gardens' downtown campus now stands. We are deeply appreciative of our presenting sponsor, Better Grow. I also want to thank our major sponsors, the State of Florida, Department of State, Division of Cultural Affairs, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, Gold Coast Eagle Distributing, Sarasota County Tourist Development Tax Revenue, and Williams Parker Harrison Dietz and Getson, as well as supporting sponsors, Travis and Kathy Brown, Jean Widener Goldstein, Terry A. Hansen, Marcy and Michael Klein, Catherine and Frank Martucci, Cornelia and J. Richard Matson, Doctors Joel Morganroth and Gail Morrison Morganroth, and Pauline L. Wamsler. Thank you for all you do to make the Orchid Show possible again this year. Thank you.
How fortunate we are to have the support of our community like that. That's a long list of sponsors and supporters, and we're very grateful for them to help make this happen. So now I want to introduce my friend and colleague, David Barry. For those of you who don't know David, he is the Associate Director of Academic Affairs and Special Projects at the Ringling Museum. David's worked with us as a consultant at Selby Gardens since 2014, mostly turning his attention to the orchid show, but helping us with other things as well. David holds a PhD in the history of museums, gardens, and libraries from the University of Oxford. So once we found out he was right down the street at the Ringling, we knew we had to work with him as much as we could. So we're very grateful that he's willing to give of his time and talents. And I want to just say that David, I feel, is uniquely qualified to give a talk on this subject. He's really such a champion of equality, and just as much as any woman I've ever known, and any man. So, you know, we've worked alongside each other doing this orchid show for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's really David who pointed out all of the female illustrators in the collection, and really thought that was an interesting and distinguishing attribute that we have, or characteristic of our botanical illustrations collection. So I think it's really his doing that we ended up with this kind of girl power show, and I'm really grateful that he pointed that out. And now I want to turn it over to David. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeannie. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure working on these projects with you and the rest of the team at Selby Gardens. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to speak today because I think that this is a fascinating subject, and I'm excited to be able to share it with all of you. First of all, welcome and good afternoon. I wish that we were able to meet in person, because it's always a great pleasure to see smiling faces in the audience, but I am glad under the circumstances that we have at least the option to connect virtually today. So thank you for your participation. I know a number of you have attended previous curatorial lectures in the past that I've given, and this may be somewhat familiar to you. I tend to like with these talks to take a couple of steps back and to approach our specific subject with a little bit of a running start, with the goal of providing some context and some background to give a broader perspective on the subject that we're discussing today. So the title of the talk is, as you can see here, Accomplished Female Botanical Artists of the 19th Century. And accomplished is a term we're going to come back and define in just a couple of minutes. And it is the work of female botanical artists represented in Selby's collection, either in printed books or loose prints in Selby Gardens Research Library, that is really the focus of the talk today, and the North Gallery of the Museum of Botany and the Arts, the current orchid show. Jeannie, if you'd move to the next slide, that will be an occasion to begin our conversation, to sort of inch up to our subject, as I mentioned earlier. So while the title says 19th century, and obviously that spans 100 years, it is really a slightly more focused period that we're interested in today, and that we're going to concentrate our efforts on. And that is the Victorian era. Jeannie, can you advance the slide? And we'll go down one bullet point. What we're talking about is the period of British history that corresponds roughly with the reign of Queen Victoria. By some definitions, it would correspond exactly with the reign of Queen Victoria, who rose to power in 1837 and died in 1901. But the influence of not just Queen Victoria, but of the sort of Victorian society tends to spill over into the first decade of the 20th century, really up to the First World War. Why I'm mentioning this is it's aspects of Victorian society that are essential to an understanding of the subject that we're going to delve into today, because Victorian society was organized hierarchically according to class and gender. And it's, of course, gender that we're going to focus on as we move forward in just a couple of minutes. As far as class is concerned, and Jeannie, if you'd drop to the next bullet, what we're talking about is something that is structurally economic and cultural. We think about the working class, the middle class, which is growing at this time period because of the impacts of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, and it is cultural. And in the case of the upper class, the aristocracy, it's largely hereditary. You sort of were born into your status and your station. But it is gender really that we're going to focus on here to provide the proper background and context to our talk. And gender roles are really central here, and the kind of a defining aspect to society during this period. They were considered biologically determined, and this gives rise to what is a sort of school of thought, which was biological determinism, and they were divinely ordained, or at least this was sort of the concept or the perception at the time. And this leads ultimately to something referred to as separate spheres in Victorian society, which is the subject we're going to explore next. Jeannie, if we advance one, we can continue on. Great. So what we're talking about are gender roles in Victorian society, and it's really at this period that those roles become most clearly divided, really more so than at any other time in history. And the reason for that, again, I mentioned it briefly earlier, is the Industrial Revolution. And this is really the result of or an impact of that point. Jeannie, you can drop to the next bullet. Up until this time, and we'll come back to that in just a second, men and women, members of a family, tended to work together in a family business that was either in or around the home. Maybe not everyone, but to a large degree, that was sort of the working dynamic through up to the end of the 18th century. With the Industrial Revolution, you have a couple of things happening. You have a shift of people from the countryside and industry, or a kind of, livelihood, for lack of a better way to describe it, based on agriculture, to people moving in ever increasing numbers into growing urban areas, so the process of urbanization, and business moving outside of the home. So you would have generally the male members of the family leaving home during the day, going to the factory or to the office, leaving wives and daughters at home. And ultimately, these two things come to be considered as separate spheres. Jeannie, if we can drop to the next point. So as mentioned, there is this concept in Victorian society of the separate spheres. And what we're talking about is sort of areas of activity and areas of influence. The ideology of separate spheres really rests on the notion of the natural characteristics, as they were considered at the time, of men and women. That idea of sort of divinely ordained and biologically determined, it was felt that men and women were fundamentally biologically different. And they were better suited to different roles. The concept at the time was that men were physically stronger and intellectually superior. And as a result of that, they were deemed to be best suited to the public or the social sphere. Jeannie, if we drop to the next point, that will cover this. And what we're talking about is basically the sphere outside the home, focused on commerce or economics, law, and politics. The flip side would be the domestic sphere or the private sphere, which was the sort of center for activities of women, of wives and daughters. Women were considered to be morally stronger than men. And as a result, they were best suited to the private or domestic sphere with a focus on housekeeping, childcare, and religion. Really religion that is central here. Women were believed to be sort of the kind of moral compass for the family. And the impact of women and the influence of women on activities in and around the home was actually one of the I wouldn't say strikes against them, but one of the reasons why there was such resistance to the suffragist movement and women's right to vote. One, that it was sort of jumping track and it was entering into that public or social sphere in which men held sort of dominance, but that women were so important as the core of the family, providing that sort of moral guidance to their husbands and to their children, that it was felt that the right to vote and doors opening for participation in wider Victorian society out in the social sphere was almost too much influence on society as a whole. So we have this division of not just gender, but gender role and sort of areas of influence. We can progress to the next slide. So I mentioned about that that sense of moral guidance and sort of moral superiority, and this being kind of a strike against women, at least as far as the suffragist movement was considered on the part of many people at the time. It was one of the points against women's rights. And it is interesting here, and I've peppered the talk with a number of historical quotes. This is a quote from Queen Victoria, who reveals herself here to be anything but a feminist. This is from a letter dated May 29th, 1870. And of course, as the monarch, this is the person that is probably most focused on maintaining that hierarchical structure that was the bedrock of Victorian society. One of the things that I love about this is, of course, the Queen refers to herself in the third person. So this is what she has to say. The Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of woman's rights, with all its attendant horrors on which her poor feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feeling and propriety. It is a subject which makes the Queen so furious that she cannot contain herself. God created men and women different, then let them remain each in their own position. And what this is sort of the perfect encapsulation of that ideology and its sort of manifestation in Victorian society that we've just been discussing. Next slide, please, Jean. So here is Queen Victoria. This is a cabinet card from 1887. This was basically a kind of a souvenir, and hundreds of thousands, presumably, of these would have been produced. This was in honor of her Jubilee, so 50 years of rule, 1837 to 1887, and she's here as Queen of Great Britain and as Empress of India. Next slide, please. So this leads us to the idea of, or the concept of accomplishments in Victorian society, and we can kind of unpack what this means as we move to the next slide. So in middle and upper class households, it was generally assumed that the girls in the family would marry. In most instances, young women were not necessarily encouraged to enter a profession, and certainly not encouraged to earn a wage. While probably every parent in a 21st century household is just chomping at the bit for their parents to leave home, or excuse me, for their children to leave home and to start kind of earning their keep. In the Victorian era, in certain segments of society, the wealthier middle and upper class families, it was almost sort of a stain on the family if young women had to pay their own way. So the focus really is not on a profession and not on making one's way in the world independently. It's on finding a suitable mate and marrying. So with the goal of attracting a husband, middle and upper class girls are trained in what come to be known as accomplishments. And they could learn these either at boarding school or more often from a resident governess, someone who is there to kind of teach them these skills and be their sort of moral and educational guide during the early years of their life. Next point, please. So in middle and upper class households, we had talked earlier about the domestic sphere being focused on, or the sort of the area of housekeeping and of childcare and of religion. But in households with means, those duties, at least housekeeping and childcare, fell to domestic servants, which left the daughters of these families with ample time to dedicate themselves to sort of this polish and finishing off, to kind of round them out, to make them eligible for marriage. Next slide, please. So when I found this image, it made me laugh because I do not have a copy of this on my shelf, but I do have a book that my mother got me when I was younger, actually a couple of them. And I remember one coming from Brooks Brothers. And it was from that book that I learned how to tie a tie, both a necktie and a bow tie. And it probably taught me, where each, fork goes on a table setting and all those kinds of things. To kind of prepare me to enter the world. Well, this is an early 19th century equivalent for young ladies. This is the Mirror of the Graces, or the English ladies' costume. So it's focused on sort of costume, dress, fashion. But it also provides, as you might be able to read there, useful advice on female accomplishments, politeness, and manner. So it's the development of certain skills, but also a certain way of acting and a certain way of sort of operating in polite society. And this work is anonymous. It is by a lady of distinction, and she gives sort of credentials having been exposed to polite society in the various nations, the refined nations of Europe. And this was a book, one of many, that were available in multiple editions over the course of the 19th century as part of that instruction of young women in these accomplishments. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about as far as accomplishments go? It's interesting and I think probably quite telling that it is difficult to find quotes from women of this period speaking on their own behalf. Probably not impossible, and if one were maybe more familiar with the wider subject than I am, there may be sources that would reveal themselves. But I did find it interesting in the preparation for both the exhibition and the talk today that it was very hard to find women speaking on these subjects clearly, directly, in their own voice. But where I did find success was actually women, and two hugely significant and very famous women, speaking through their literary characters. So in this case, we have Jane Austen speaking through the character of Carolyn Bingley in Pride and Prejudice in 1813. And Carolyn Bingley is kind of an uppity young figure. She's one of the, competitors to our main figure in sort of establishing herself as an eligible young woman, vying for the hand of an affluent and accomplished young gentleman. So here it is, and she gives a perfect sort of encapsulation of what we're talking about. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, and generally what she's referring to is sort of playing the piano, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, say French and Italian, to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. So this actually helps to kind of explain the long list of subjects covered by the book that we saw the title page and frontispiece to. It covers not only the skills, in terms of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, but also the manner, the dress, etc., that are referenced here in the quote. Next slide, please, Jeannie. This is a portrait of Jane Austen, produced by her sister, Cassandra, who, like Jane, would have gone through this process, would have been trained in these various skills. And of course, in Jane Austen's case, becomes a sort of source of inspiration for one of the great literary works of the age. Next slide, please. As a counterpoint, I have included this quote by Jane Eyre, a central character in Charlotte Bronte's novel of that name, Jane Eyre, published in 1847, making it clear here that focusing all one's efforts on sort of refining their manner and developing certain skills may not, in the end, be enough. So this is what Jane Eyre has to say on the subject. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. It is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. Next slide, please. And this is a portrait of Charlotte Bronte, the author, by George Richmond in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Next slide, please. So from kind of an outline of Victorian society and this concept of separate spheres, and the idea of accomplishments being the sort of socially acceptable activities of a young woman in a middle or upper class household in that domestic realm, that domestic sphere, we get to the idea of drawing, in particular of drawing flowers. And I have another quote. Next slide, please. And in this case, it comes from a man named John Claudius Loudon. Loudon was a Scotsman. He was a prolific writer on horticultural subjects. He was the publisher of the publication referenced here, The Gardener's Magazine, which was a tremendously popular horticultural sort of periodical of the era, through which all kinds of information on botany, horticulture, gardening, etc., were sort of disseminated to the masses. Loudon is also very well known as a landscape gardener and architect, sort of a garden designer, as well as greenhouse designer. He was a major figure in the botanical world of the 19th century. And this is what he has to say on the subject. To be able to draw flowers botanically and fruit horticulturally, that is, with the characteristics by which varieties and subvarieties are distinguished, is one of the most useful accomplishments of young ladies of leisure living in the country. So for most of the women who are learning to draw or to paint with watercolor or to embroider, there isn't the goal of establishing oneself in a career or entering into illustration as a profession. But it is the foundation for those that ultimately do pursue that path. And what we'll come to in a minute is some of those key figures, and I'll introduce you to a little bit of their background and their history. Every one of them has a contact or a connection that enables them to sort of move forward in the field. But the foundation of that were the skills that they developed, the accomplishment of drawing that they developed as a young woman generally in a middle-class household. So here's an illustration of Loudon again from the National Portrait Gallery in London. Next slide, please. So for as part of the kind of the developments of the basics, the kind of rudiments of drawing or draftsmanship, there were sources that one could reference, just like the Mirror of the Graces that we saw earlier as far as manner and dress. This is basically a how-to guide to illustrate botanically. And this would be supplemented by teaching or instruction, as we mentioned earlier, either at boarding school or possibly at the hands of a governess in the household. But here you have Bowles' Drawing Book for Ladies. This is late 18th century version, but it was republished, multiple editions throughout the course of the late 18th and the 19th centuries. And as you can see here, an extensive and curious collection of the most beautiful flowers, all drawn after nature. So it is a drawing book, but you can see also the complete florist. So it really is focused on drawing flowers. Not necessarily to illustrate botanical publications or horticultural publications. That is a kind of a step beyond. But flowers were an appropriate subject, and they were a popular subject for young ladies learning the basics of drawing. And you can see here that the illustrations in the book take two forms. One, there are sort of finished illustrations at the end for reference, but this is basically a how-to guide, how you might flesh out a detailed illustration from a simpler and more basic initial sketch. And again, a reference to help young ladies in their development. Next slide, please. So the last subject before we delve into the lives of the particular illustrators represented in the show that I want to talk about is the professionalization of botany in the 19th century, and the role of women, both as botanical illustrators and otherwise, in that process. So I've titled the section Ladies Botany, and I will explain the reason for that in just a second. We'll go to the next slide with another quote. And this is a quote by one of the key botanical figures of the 19th century, a gentleman named John Lindley. And this is from his inaugural lecture as professor of botany at the University of London in 1829. Lindley was an English botanist and horticulturalist, actively involved in publication, one of the most prolific writers on botany in the 19th century. For our purposes, he's also hugely significant because he is arguably the greatest orchidologist or expert in orchids in history. And without question, his writings on orchids in the early to sort of, I should say, middle to late part of the 19th century really lay the foundation for the modern study of orchids. But Lindley is the key figure in this process of professionalization. And this is what he has to say to his audience, to the next generation of professional scientists in 1829. It has been very much the fashion of late years in this country, it's talking about England or Great Britain, to undervalue the importance of this science, botany, and to consider it an amusement for ladies rather than an occupation for the serious thoughts of man. So what's going on here? What is he referring to? In the 18th century, tied with the Enlightenment, botany was sort of a popular pursuit that a wide segment of society engaged in. And it was an area that was socially acceptable for young women to participate in. And what we're talking about is plant collecting by sort of walking in the countryside, pressing plants, as well as drawing plants, and in some instances, even naming or classifying plants. By the time we get into the 1820s and 1830s, Lindley is trying to separate out what he sees to be modern scientific botany from those activities of an earlier era. And he sees the activities of modern science being professionally grounded and really the purview of well-educated men. And he's separating out from those activities that I described earlier, which had a strong feminine association because it was probably the science as it existed in the 18th century that women had the greatest access to. So Lindley is he is really the most vocal advocate and influential advocate for the professionalization of botany in the 19th century. This process of professionalization is by no means exclusive to botany. This is happening to disciplines across the spectrum. And what you have is a sort of separation of the work of the generalist from the specialist and the leaving behind of the sort of the subject as a popular pastime as it would have been in the late 18th and early 19th century, and kind of regrounding it in science as it would have been understood at the time, making it a professional occupation for the educated elite. So here is an illustration of Lindley, again from the National Portrait Gallery in London. Next slide, please. Lindley produced a whole series of very scholarly works on botany, but he was equally prolific as a writer of popular works on the subject. So while he is the principal advocate for the professionalization of the science, he does see that it is important to engage a wider audience in botanical subjects. So we'll come back to a couple of those in a minute, but the best illustration of this is his Ladies' Botany of 1834 to 1837. It is these 2 volumes produced over that 3-year stretch. And this is the clearest indication of the role that he saw, aside from illustration, although it is directly tied to this, the role that he saw women playing in this process of professionalization, which we talked about as being sort of the purview of the well-educated man. And that is the role of mother. And this is reflected in this book, Ladies' Botany, because the book is structured as 50 letters to a mother who is interested in educating her children about the natural world. So it is Lindley communicating through sort of accessible language some pretty sophisticated scientific concepts, but it's to a general reader, to a mother who is interested in imparting that wisdom to the next generation. And of course, from Lindley's perspective, it is kind of planting a seed for future growth, to inspire an interest in nature in the young that ultimately will germinate, possibly through the pursuit of botany as a career in the decades to follow. So in addition to the accessible text, you have a series of really beautiful illustrations and interesting in relation to the others that we're going to see, because they really are instructive. They correspond very closely to what he's describing in the text. And these are the work of a woman named Sarah Drake, who had a very strong and very long association with Lindley and with the Lindley family. So we'll use that as the bridge to the first of our illustrators as represented in the show. The copy that I just showed you of Lindley's work, Ladies Botany, I pulled off the internet, but Selby's copy of the set is actually on display in the Orchid Show, and I would encourage you to go and see it. So the illustrator is a young woman named Sarah Drake, and we can go to the next slide. This is the only image that I could find of her. If we go back one, Jeannie, the only portrait of her, and unfortunately it's hard to find portraits of all of the illustrators, because as Jeannie mentioned earlier, not all of them were terribly well known outside of a very small world of sort of botanists and botanical publishers of that time period. But this is a sketch of Sarah Drake by two of John Lindley's daughters, or one or the other of John Lindley's daughters, Sarah or Barbara. Sarah Drake was childhood friends with John Lindley's sister Anne, and through that connection she gets to know the Lindley family, and ultimately John Lindley invites Sarah Drake to join his household, his wife and daughters, as it's thought potentially as a governess. But she trained with Lindley as a botanical artist or botanical illustrator. Lindley was actually quite accomplished as an illustrator, but he is so prolific as a publisher and as a writer that he simply can't keep up with the output of work. So he sees in Drake those basic skills that she would have developed earlier in life as a draftsperson being kind of expanded here and applied to scientific illustration, really with a great emphasis on accuracy of plants from nature, not plants out of a pattern book like we saw with the Bowles publication, and using her powers of observation, her attention to detail, as well as obviously the hand skills that she's developed over time. And Drake becomes, through Lindley's support, one of the great and certainly most prolific botanical artists of the 19th century. And she produces for his and other publications over 300 illustrations of orchids alone, and is probably the most prolific illustrator of orchids of that era. The connection with orchids is such that actually Lindley names the genus Drachia, this is a genus of orchids from Western Australia, in her honor. Jeannie, can we move to the next slide, please? So this is one of the two, and the other is the next slide, illustrations that are actually featured in the show. And these are both from the Botanical Register, or what at one point was Edward's Botanical Register, and these are both from the 1830s, while Drake is working with Lindley in and around the Lindley household. This is a book that John Lindley was the editor of, or I should say kind of, not exactly a periodical, but it was a publication issued in parts and in installments. You had a certain amount of text and then the images corresponded. I want to make the point here, and this is true for all the illustrations that we'll see moving forward, that what we are looking at in the slide and what you will see when you go visit the show are printed images. They are engravings for publication. What Sarah Drake produced and the other illustrators that we're focused on today is the preparatory work. So it is not the printed piece. There would have been an engraver who took her drawing or her watercolor painting and translated it into the image that you see. So she is the author of the original image, off of which or from which this is based. We can move forward. So she produced hundreds of illustrations of orchids and other species for the Botanical Register and other publications, almost all of which had some sort of connection with Lindley. But she's probably best known for a work that she collaborated with another illustrator on, who's our next subject in just a second. And this is James Bateman's The Orchidaceae of Mexico and Guatemala. And Drake was one of the two botanical illustrators featured in the work. This is one of the great treasures of Selby's library, and it is one of the great botanical books of all time. When institutions like the Natural History Museum in London or the American Museum of Natural History in New York have in recent years published highlights of their library collections or bibliographic collections, this is a book that they have featured in those publications as being one of the great illustrated books of all time, natural history books of all time. And Selby has a beautiful copy that is one of the central pieces to the show this year. For those of you that remember the Secret Garden show 5 years ago, we featured this book in that initial exhibition, and this was the illustration that was on view at that point. So this is Sarah Drake's illustration of Sibrelia. To give you a sense, this was the largest book on orchids ever produced. So this is as large a book as you can produce with a conventional sheet of paper as it was at the time. It's referred to as an elephant or double elephant folio volume. It is an absolute whopper. And when you go and see it on display, you'll see that it fits very nicely into the case in which it's presented. The reason for that is we used this book when we had those cases designed 5 years ago as the basis for the sizing of the case. And my dear friend and colleague, Keith Crowley, who designed the cases, I must have pestered to death, just making sure that when it came to display that this was actually going to fit, because it is an extraordinary volume, the largest book of its type ever produced, and also one of the rarest, because there are only 125 copies that were printed, and I would say a fraction of that survived today intact, still bound as a book, as opposed to loose prints. The benefit of size was that the plants could be drawn and illustrated at full size, as in life. And that is true of this and the other illustration that I will show you in a minute. But this is one of the great orchid books of all time, one of the great illustrated natural history books of all time, and Drake was central to that. There were 40 hand-colored lithographs, the lithograph being the print, the preparatory drawings or paintings for which were produced by Sarah Drake and a woman named Augusta Withers. And we'll transition to her now, after we take a quick look at Bateman. So this is Bateman. This is the author, if we go back one. And he was a wealthy Victorian gentleman, and he underwrote a number of botanical expeditions to various parts of the world. So he basically paid for, he did not go himself, but he paid for the expeditions to Central and South America, through which the plants that are illustrated in the book were brought back to England. And some of you may remember the name Bateman from previous shows, particularly the show where we focused on Charles Darwin, because Bateman is the gentleman who sent Darwin what is now referred to commonly as Darwin's orchid, or the star orchid that he had sent back from Madagascar. What I love and why I chose to include this image is this does not look like someone who necessarily would crack a joke. Doesn't look like someone with a great sense of humor, which I realize is presumptive on my part, but particularly someone with, at this point, thanks to quarantine, with heavy facial hair. But I get a kick out of the fact that Bateman, in his own publication, included the following vignette. He basically included a cartoon or a little caricature of the book itself in the publication by one of the great sort of satirical illustrators of the late 18th and early 19th century, George Cruikshank. And this is a little illustration in the book entitled The Librarian's Nightmare, It's almost something out of Gulliver's Travels here, of all these gentlemen trying to hoist up the largest book on orchids ever produced. So this is a little bit of whimsy, a little bit of humor, somewhat unexpectedly in this otherwise serious publication. Next slide, please. So Sarah Drake's fellow illustrator on that book was a woman named Augusta Withers. If we progress to the next slide, you will see an example of her contribution to Bateman's Orchidea of Mexico and Guatemala. This beautiful illustration of a cattleya, probably the most famous illustration from the book. And this is what is on view currently in the gallery. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, and you are in the area, I would definitely encourage you to go and take a look, because as impressive as it is on your computer screen, it pales in comparison to what it is in real life. So Augusta Withers was an extremely accomplished illustrator who had a little bit of a kind of rocky road through her career. Periods of great activity, and then periods of almost sort of inactivity and bordering on sort of crisis, where she struggled to make ends meet and to kind of continue in active employment. Withers was an extremely talented illustrator, as you can see here, of flowers, but it's probably fruit for which she has come to be best known. And if we progress to the next image, you can see an example from a publication of from none other than John Lindley. This is his Pomologia Britannica, or Botanica. This is a book on the edible fruits of Great Britain. And this is another popular publication, illustrated by the fact that it does not include the scientific names of the plants. It's only the common names, as they were understood at the time, that are used to sort of caption the images. But this doesn't really do it justice, but this and the next, if we progress, you can see these beautiful illustrations of fruit by Augusta Withers. I would encourage you, you can find examples of this online. This is not a publication, this is not one of Selby's copies, but the drawings are absolutely exquisite. She was masterful in her rendering of the kind of textures of fruit. So much so that she, in addition to sort of making a career of this by producing images for the botanical and horticultural popular and scientific works of the day, she receives at times royal patronage as a result of her work. So she becomes flower painter in ordinary to Queen Adelaide. Queen Adelaide was the wife of King William IV of Great Britain, predecessor to Queen Victoria. And then under Queen Victoria, Augusta Withers becomes flower and fruit painter in ordinary. What does that mean? What that means is basically in the employ of, as opposed to a kind of hereditary title, to the Queen. And the Queen purchases works and sort of provides support through the title, helping Withers to secure further commissions, and she produced an extraordinary output of some of the most brilliantly rendered depictions of fruit and flowers of that era. Next slide, please. The next illustrator is a woman named Harriet Ann Thistleton Dyer. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a picture of her. Harriet's sort of a fascinating figure. She is the daughter of Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was at the time, the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and also editor of Curtis's Botanical Magazine. So Harriet was born of the sort of leading botanical family of Great Britain. Her grandfather was William Jackson Hooker, who was the first director of Kew Gardens. And both William and Joseph were knighted. And they received all the awards that were available at the time in terms of recognition for their contributions to science and to botany at that period. Her husband, William Turner Thistleton Dyer, ultimately succeeds her father as director of Kew Gardens. So she has a connection to the first three directors of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, really the foremost botanical garden at that time, as it really is today in the world. So she is growing up in an environment that is botanical through and through. And as a young woman, she is not exactly apprenticed, but she studies with a man named Walter Hood Fitch, who was the leading illustrator for Curtis's Botanical magazine at the time. Curtis's Botanical magazine is a fascinating publication. This was sort of a popular publication issued in installments. And it is the longest running botanical publication, really probably the longest running biological publication in the world. It was started by a man named William Curtis in 1787. Curtis produced a beautiful illustrated book of the flora of the area around London, which nearly bankrupted him and was a commercial failure in his lifetime, although it is one of these books that, with the benefit of hindsight, is now a great treasured work of botany. But to get himself out of a hole, he produces this other book, the Botanical Magazine, which is the one that ultimately became most famous, and has been in continual operation. It's been in print since it was first issued in 1787. Selby Gardens has a complete set of Curtis's Botanical Magazine, which is a great rarity and certainly a great treasure. Walter Hood Fitch, the gentleman from whom Harriet learned the basics of botanical illustration, was the chief illustrator of the magazine at the time and reported to her father here. This is Joseph Dalton Hooker, Harriet's dad. I think probably the leading candidate for greatest eyebrows of the 19th century. He just always has this quite formidable look. For those that know the name or not, Joseph Dalton Hooker was the great and closest friend of Charles Darwin, the man in whom Darwin sort of confided as in the years leading up to the publication of On the Origin of Species. They were great lifelong friends. So Harriet's growing up in rather sort of privileged scientific environment. But she comes to Dad's rescue ultimately, because Joseph Dalton Hooker and Walter Hood Fitch have a falling out over salary for Fitch's illustrations for Curtis's Botanical Magazine. And he leaves in a huff, basically, which leaves Hooker without someone to illustrate the publication. And it is his daughter, if we go to the next slide, that saves the day. She fills in for Fitch and for her father in a couple of years here until a new full-time illustrator could be found. So it's as much due to Harriet that the Curtis's Botanical Magazine remained unbroken in its publication as to anyone. And she produced a series of very, very beautiful and very sensitively rendered images. Next slide, please. So the woman that ultimately both worked with and then succeeded Harriet was Matilda Smith. And we have a photograph of her in the next slide. Matilda Smith was born in India, but she emigrates with her family to England in childhood, in her early years. So she grows up in England, and she is second cousin to Joseph Dalton Hooker. Everybody has some sort of connection here. She showed a kind of proficiency in drawing as a young woman. And Joseph Dalton Hooker invites her to Kew Gardens, and Matilda becomes inspired by the work of Walter Hood Fitch. Like Harriet before her, she sort of is exposed to his work. She develops her skills and ultimately takes over as the lead illustrator for Curtis's Botanical Magazine for 40 years, during which she produces over 2,300 images, separate images of plants, which is truly extraordinary, second only to Fitch in terms of output in the 200+ year history of that publication. We go to the next slide, please. So this is one of the 2,300 illustrations, this spectacular image, which is a trifold. This actually you have to open up because it is half again as wide as the publication itself, for this beautiful illustration of Ceropetalum fletcherianum from 1915. Matilda Smith, as with Harriet Thistleton Dyer, lives into the early part of the 20th century. Matilda Smith dies in the 1920s, and Harriet continues on until the 1940s, continuing to illustrate for either Curtis or for other publications. In the case of Matilda Smith, her contributions to Curtis's Botanical Magazine are recognized in a couple of ways. She is appointed the first official botanical artist at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and this is a position that has remained filled by illustrators ever since. And then she receives significant medals from the Royal Horticultural Society, and ultimately 2 genera of plants are named after her. Smithiana and Smithiella are named in her honor. So did achieve a certain level of distinction, or at least recognition, for her contributions to botany through the arts. Next slide, please. So I had asked Jeannie about the idea of adding 2 final illustrators to the list that are not featured in the Orchid Show, but whose stories, at least from my perspective, are so interesting that I thought we should include them here today. And they are 2 fascinating figures that I include in some of the courses that I teach on the art of natural history at New College. The first is a woman named Anna Atkins, and if we go to the next slide, you can see a picture of her. So Anna Atkins was the daughter of a man named John George Children, who held a significant position at the British Museum, the Natural History section, but ultimately became the Natural History Museum in London, and the Royal Society of London, so the great sort of scientific society in Great Britain. So she too, like Harriet Ann Thistleton Dyer, is growing up in a scientific household. And she's actively encouraged to pursue an interest in science from her father. Next slide, please. So Anna, like the others, develops skill as a draftsperson, as an artist, and she produces over 200 illustrations for her father's translation of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's Genera of Shells, published in 1823. So this is 20 or so of those 200 beautifully rendered images. But it is not as a draftsperson that ultimately she changed the world. It is as a photographer. And we can transition to the next slide. So Anna's father oversaw the meeting of the Royal Society of London in 1839, at which a young William Henry Fox Talbot introduced to the world phonogenic drawing, what today we would refer to as photography. And both father and daughter are fascinated by this new development. So Anna becomes very passionate about photography, and she ultimately produces the first work that applies photography to science. And actually, it is one of the first works in which photography is applied not only to science, but to publication. This is the first photographically produced book, also the book featuring a photograph. And what you're looking at here is a series of cyanotypes. So this is her publication, Photographs of British Algae. This was her personal collection of algae, primarily seaweed, cyanotype impressions produced in installments between 1843 and 1853. So the cyanotype is a blueprint. And this was basically a form of photographic print produced by a close friend, a man named Sir John Herschel, who was a famous astronomer, but also inventor, and he develops the cyanotype in 1842. Anna is fascinated by this, and ultimately contact prints, or really sort of sun prints, a series of these beautiful images. The entire book is produced photographically. So the text, for example, is a photograph of her handwriting, and then these are contact prints of actual dried specimens in her collection. Every page is a photograph that had to be hand prepared and hand produced, which explains why in a book that features over 400 images, it took 10 years to produce. This was printed privately, and it was for distribution to friends and to institutions. 13 copies or so survive in various sort of stages of completion. But it is one of the key works in the history of science, the history of photography, and the history of publishing. It is a monumental work in all three areas, but also at the end of the day, just simply a beautiful series of images, very, very carefully and skillfully produced. Next slide, please. So the year in which that work was completed, Anna and a dear, dear friend, Anne Dixon, whose maiden name was Anne Austen, this was a second cousin to Jane Austen, that we discussed earlier, produced a collaborative work on cyanotypes of British and foreign ferns in 1853. This is the cover and title page, again, produced photographically. Every single version of this is a separate photograph that they would have produced by hand. And then the next slide is an illustration of the contents of the work. Anna Atkins in her work is an absolutely fascinating subject. I am happy to report that there have been a number in recent years of really beautifully prepared and well-researched works on her that are now available in publication. So if you are interested, you can pick up a copy for your shelf at home. These images came from the Getty that has digitized their collection. Again, one of a very select few that have survived intact to the present day. And they're photographed at very high resolution, so it allows you to see these beautiful works in great detail. So from Anna Atkins, I wanted to introduce you to, wrong way to describe it because it's a name you already know, but to include one final illustrator. And it might be a name that is a little surprising in this context, and that is, of course, Beatrix Potter. Next slide, please. So here is Helen. Beatrix was her second name, but she went by Beatrix to differentiate her from her mother, also Helen, with her pet mouse, Zarifa, in 1885. So Beatrix Potter grew up in a wealthy middle-class English household in London. She had a pretty lonely childhood until her brother Walter was born, in the care of nurses, because she was often ill or sickly, and governesses. So she is trained in the various skills, the accomplishments that we discussed earlier, but she sort of retreats into her own little world and her own little imagination. She kept a journal that she wrote in cipher that was not actually deciphered until 1958, that is filled with very astute observations of all aspects of her life, but particularly the natural world, which she becomes fascinated by as a child, and that carries through life. So the family would take vacations multiple times a year to either Scotland or to the Lake District in England. And she spent a lot of time, for someone that grew up in an urban environment in the countryside. And this instilled in her a love for nature. And she and her brother actually bring a little bit of nature home. They have a natural history collection that they housed in their room, which included specimens, say bugs pinned to board and that kind of thing, shells, etc., birds' eggs in particular. But also living animals, live animals, and Zarifa is one. But it is not as much the mice as it is the rabbits that ultimately become most famous. So here is Beatrix Potter with her pet rabbit Benjamin Bouncer in 1891. So as a young woman, she develops skills as an artist. She invests her time and effort in the collecting of natural history and spending time in nature on holiday with her family. And through all of those experiences, she develops an interest in mycology, or fungi. If we go to the next slide, you will see one of her exquisite illustrations of a mushroom. This is the crimson waxcap. And she produced dozens and dozens of these really beautiful illustrations, almost sort of perfectly rendered illustrations of these mushrooms that became a subject of fascination for her. And she does take a step beyond illustration in that she actually writes a scientific paper on the subject, which was presented on her behalf at the Linnean Society of London. This is the great sort of natural history society in London in 1897. Was presented on her behalf because, of course, at that point, women were not admitted to either the society or to meetings. Matilda Smith, that we just discussed a couple of minutes ago, was the second woman to be offered a kind of partial membership in an honorary way through her contributions to Curtis a little bit later on. But here, this is a paper, a scientific paper on mycology presented on Beatrix Potter's behalf at that meeting. And it was relatively well received, but it didn't ultimately lead to a career as a scientist, because we are talking about the society that we discussed at the beginning, in which advancement through on the road to professional status as a scientist wasn't really open to women like Beatrix. It was the purview almost exclusively of well-educated men. But in this instance, science's loss is, of course, the great gain to children's literature, because all of the skills that she develops, not only the hand skills to be able to produce beautiful illustrations like the one you see here, but the powers of observation and the understanding and familiarity with nature are redirected for ultimately for the benefit of the world as a whole. We can transition to the next image. So in 1901, Beatrix self-published 250 copies of this book, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which began life as a little story that she included in a letter to a young boy named Noel Moore. Noel was the daughter of Beatrix's final governess, a woman named Annie Moore, and Beatrix would write to the children of her governess anytime she was outside London, so when she was on those vacations in the countryside. And she would tell them stories involving animals that were either in her collection or that she was experiencing out there in the wild. So this particular letter was dated 1893, but it becomes the subject of her first book in 1901. And she did attempt to have it published by a publisher and to enter the trade, but it was rejected repeatedly. So she took it upon herself to publish of her own accord. If you happen to have this edition at home, you want to be very, very careful with it and take very, very good care, because it is probably one of the most valuable works of children's literature ever. There's only one image produced in color. It is otherwise black and white, but it is the beginning of a series of nearly 22 stories that are some of the most beloved in all of children's literature. So in 1901, she produces this, and they are distributed like the Atkins work to sort of family, friends, and acquaintances. But one copy ultimately ends up in the hands of Frederick Warne and Company, publishers of London. So if we move to the next slide. And they produce a trade copy in 1902, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and this is probably recognizable to everyone, because every one of the 22 books that ultimately are published by Warne and Company of Potter's works are formatted in the same way. These little books with the green binding, with beautiful colored illustrations, which was the recommendation of the publisher in terms of entering the trade. And Beatrix Potter became hugely successful around the world through her stories of animals. They are, of course, anthropomorphized. It's animals sort of living and speaking as human beings, but at the heart of that is a deep understanding based on her experience as a kind of naturalist and illustrator. So she produces these extraordinary works, and she becomes very successful financially as a result. Through her connection with Warne and Company, she meets Norman Warne, who was her editor, and in 1905, they become engaged to marry against her family's wishes. But unfortunately, the engagement doesn't last, because within just a couple of weeks of the engagement, Norman Warne dies of leukemia. And as a result, Beatrix leaves London and she goes to the Lake District. And if we follow, move to the next slide, you'll see the final image in our presentation. And she had bought a farm known as Hilltop Farm in the Lake District. So she sort of leaves London and the memory of Norman and her publishing behind. She does continue to write, and quite successfully so. But her interests begin to shift from kind of London society and children's books to farming, agriculture, and ultimately the raising of Hardwick sheep. She raised prize sheep. And she uses the profits from all of her various ventures to buy up land in the Lake District, additional farms, usually adjacent properties. And for over 30 years, she's either buying herself or she's working with the National Trust in England to buy up large tracts of land in the Lake District through her sort of support and intervention. And when she dies, ultimately, she leaves over 4,000 acres in that area to the National Trust, which forms part of Britain's largest national park. So in addition to being a kind of a naturalist and collector of natural history, a very successful, or at least in terms of the quality of the work, illustrator of fungi. And I should mention that her illustrations were many years after her death. They were included in what is still the kind of leading work on the fungi of Great Britain. But she becomes an early land conservationist and leaves a great legacy through this land that she kept from developers, which is now part of national heritage in Great Britain and there for the public to enjoy. And with that, I will bring our talk to a close, and with whatever time we have left, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Thank you, David. It was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of our participants did too. Getting some really nice comments and compliments. Everybody loves your talks. Thank you for enlightening us to a fascinating subject. Thank you, David, from Roberta and Frank. This was marvelous, great talk, marvelous, clap, clap, clap. So I'm not sure that we have many questions. I'll leave that open for a little bit just to see. And I just want to give everyone a heads up that we have 2 additional talks this season surrounding the Orchid Show. On November 18th, John McCarthy from Spanish Point will be talking about Bertha Palmer's garden. And on December 9th, we'll have Olivia Breda, our director of botanical art here at Selby Gardens, talking about kind of the history of botanical art. So I want to make sure that that you all tune into that, and an invitation will be going out very soon to register. Somebody had commented earlier that it wasn't as easy to register for our talks this year, and I just want to explain that. We've decided to make most of our lectures a members perk, just to give our members, you know, kind of some reasons to keep coming back and visiting us, even if they're far away. And so that's why our registration is a little bit different this year. But a note will be going out to all members and donors in the coming week or so to register for these upcoming talks. Olivia Breda said, thank you very much for leading us to Beatrix Potter. It was a delightful way to end your talk. Much appreciated. And Sandra Biller says, thank you, Jeannie and David, for arranging these lectures. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm not seeing any specific questions. I think you covered your subject very well, David. So thanks again for sharing your enthusiasm and all of your knowledge with us. And it makes the show that much more interesting.
Yes, and for those of you that are in the area, I would encourage you to go see both the living collections in the Tropical Conservatory, but to go see the books and prints in the Museum of Botany and the Arts as well. As fun as it is to talk about it today, it pales in comparison to seeing the real thing in person.
Agree, 100%. So the show is on through November 29th in the conservatory, and actually through December 24th in the museum. So if you can't get here by the 29th, but you still want to come in after that, you can still see the museum collection up through the end of the year. So thank you all so very much, and take care. Thanks, David. Bye.